SMERU is actually have this practicing the work from home system. So usually we only have like around 3 to 5 people in the office. So allow me to introduce myself. My name is Asri Yusrina. I'm a senior researcher at SMERU, and I will be moderating today's discussions. And I think I will like to introduce our speakers. For today's discussion is Sam Bazi. Is it correct if the way I pronounce it? Okay. So Sam was a visiting junior scholar back in 2005 and 2006, and he worked on a study about BLT, right? And also BOS after the fuel subsidy cut. And this is a spoiler alert from Asep actually. Sam is a durian lover. So for his farewell party, he bought a lot of durian for SMERU colleagues, and perhaps today we could order it online. And have it later for today. And so Sam is a professor in Department of Economics and School of Global Policy and Strategy at University of California, San Diego. And he will present his newest publications, I think it's on May, right? Along with his colleague, Mashur Hilmi from Boston University, and also Benjamin Marks from Boston University. Just a quick heads up about today's discussions. Sam is going to present a study about how the policy of SD impress in the 70s affect educational preference, the identity and national building in the later years up until the 90s, if I'm not correct. So looking forward to the discussions. And before we begin, I would like to remind all the participants who present at the SMERU's office or join via Zoom to fill the attendance list. And we will have a 40 minutes presentation from Sam, and then followed by Q&A sessions up until 4 p.m. Okay, without further ado, the time is yours.
All right. Thank you, Ibu Asri, for a very kind introduction. It's really nice to be back to Indonesia. It's been, I think, almost 7 years, maybe longer. A lot has happened since then. I've had kids. There was this thing called COVID, but I'm really happy to be back. And it's nice to see some old students and RAs in the audience and catch up with old friends from SMERU. So this, oops, is this on? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So this is joint work, as Ibu Asri said, with Mashur Hilmi, who I should have updated his affiliation. He was my former student at Boston University. He recently graduated and is starting as an assistant professor at the University of New South Wales in Australia. So really a rising Indonesian economist whose work you should really look out for in the years ahead. And then Ben Marks is my French colleague who is rapidly becoming an expert on Indonesia. So someone that I've worked with a lot recently, and I've learned a lot from. Okay, so let me begin with a little bit of motivation. I think, if we look at kind of the history of economic development across the entire world, what happens throughout the process of development is that states are really kind of building up the capacity to provide public goods and services across many sectors of the economy, right? And at the same time, while they're trying to do that, incumbent informal providers are often resisting those efforts by the state. Right? You can think about religious courts resisting efforts by the state to introduce civil courts. You can think about traditional medicine providers, traditional healers resisting the kind of advance of modern medicine, and the list really goes on, right? And one really kind of major example of this tension between informal and formal state providers of public goods and services is education. And this was really kind of central in a lot of countries in the context of mass schooling reforms, right? Where states mandate education and they provide, they supply the institutions that are necessary to meet that new mandated demand, right? And at the same time, this is really often a source of tensions, right, between the church and the state, right? And if you look at the history of Europe, for example, there's lots of discussion of so-called school wars or curriculum wars, right? And what we're going to do in this paper is ask how religious schools, the incumbent informal providers, are responding to the rise of mass schooling. How are they engaging in competitive kind of activities to counter or complement the activities of the state in this new domain of education? Okay, and we're going to do that here in Indonesia, right, where historically Islamic schools have been really a really important provider of education across the country. And if you look today, a little over 1/5 of students, according to administrative data from 2019, are enrolled in some form of Islamic school. Now, what we're going to study in terms of the kind of mass schooling reform is one that you're all probably familiar with, is Sekolah Dasar Inpres, right? The SD Inpres program, which Esther Duflo was one of the first to study kind of systematically and characterize how human capital increased in Indonesia as a result of that program and how affected cohorts were able to increase their wages as a result of that higher education. Okay. There's been a ton of work on this program looking at a whole set of broad outcomes related to human capital. What's really been missing from a lot of the empirical research on the program, though, is the more ideological and political aspects of this policy in this particular period in in the history of Indonesian development. Okay, and in particular, this was part and parcel of a broader set of efforts by the Suharto regime to really homogenize and secularize the national education system. What we're going to do is study how the Islamic education sector, a decentralized collection of organizations and local leaders, responded to this effort by the state. Okay, let me summarize what we're going to find, and then we'll spend the rest of the talk going into some of those details. Okay. So the first thing, the really kind of striking fact, is that counter to many other episodes of mass schooling efforts by developing states, the INPRES program did not crowd out Islamic schools. And in fact, what we see is looking across districts that had varying exposure to school construction, we saw an increase in Islamic schools at all levels of education in those more intensely affected districts and regions of the country. Okay, and interestingly, we'll see evidence of both substitution and complementarities. Okay, so we'll see in some places Islamic elementary schools, madrasa ibtidaiyah, actually were not built because the state had built a school in that community. But in other places, we'll see that they were in fact built. And in fact, in many contexts, the Islamic sector built junior secondary schools, madrasa sanawiyah, to capture these new crop of graduating public primary school students, right? And they were able to fill a void that the state was not able to meet, at least in the short run. Okay. The other thing we're able to see for a subset of Islamic schools is an increase in the religious content of education, both in terms of a kind of broad array of Islamic subjects, as well as Arabic language instruction. Okay. Finally, we'll see within the Islamic schooling system a shift from informal schools, pesantren, into the more formal madrasa, which follow the system that the sekolah follow here in Indonesia. Okay, so that's on the supply side. And then on the demand side, we'll see patterns that look very similar. Okay, so we'll see a little bit of crowd out at the elementary level, especially for boys, where we'll see a reduction in the likelihood of attending an Islamic elementary school in communities where the state built more SD Inpres. But at the same time, at the secondary level, we'll see an increase in attendance in Islamic secondary schools for those exposed cohorts. Okay, so then the question is, overall, what happened? And what we're able to see is actually for cohorts who were really about to enter primary school right at the time that SD Inpres were being built in their communities, we see an increase in Islamic schooling overall at the end of their by the end of their educational lives when the survey is capturing that information. Okay, So then the kind of final part of the paper, and I'll just summarize this kind of briefly at the end. We probably won't have time to get into all of the nitty-gritty details. What we then ask is, what happened as a result of this competition between religious and state schools? Okay, and here what we're going to see is that for exposed cohorts, right, we're not going to see much of a change in their support for New Order policies, as well as for our best efforts to measure support for Pancasila, and support for Suharto's party at the time, Golkar. Right? Instead, what we're going to see is an increase in religiosity, an increase in piety among exposed cohorts, and kind of greater attachment to their religious identity compared to the kids in their own community who had already completed their education prior to the arrival of Este and Prez. Okay, and so you put those together, and we'll trace out a little bit of kind of intergenerational transmission. Parents who are exposed, their kids are more likely to attend Islamic schools and be a bit more religious, at least in terms of what we can see inside the home. And then you kind of ask, like, how could that arise without a kind of strong response by the Islamic education sector? Okay, and so all told, this is really suggesting that the competitive response by the religious education sector really worked against some of the kind of secularizing and homogenizing objectives of the regime at the time. Okay, so that's the broad sweep of the paper. We're filling a few gaps in the literature, and really the kind of key innovation here in the Indonesian context is that we're really highlighting a kind of missing dimension of the history of education policy and evolution in this space over the last 50 to 60 years. Okay, so let me now get into the details, right, and try and give you a sense of how we came to these conclusions. Okay, so the first kind of piece of background, which, I guess given this audience, I usually have to spend a lot of time motivating and describing the institutional background. With all of you, I probably don't have to do that. But there's, of course, a very long history of religious education in this country. And then comes along in the 1970s, President Suharto, who you can see here in an Este Inprez school, and which happens to look quite different, a little bit different than this is, I believe, the Guntur Islamic School in Central Java, of course, a famous pesantren in the country. But the regime at the time really viewed Sekolah Dasar as a key vehicle for building a national identity, right? And a kind of vehicle for advancing Pancasila objectives, as well as knowledge and use of the national language. Okay, and at the same time, this is a scholar, Muhammad Zuhdi, who's written a lot about the history of education and kind of the politics of it in Indonesia, argued that a lot of the efforts in the 70s by the Suharto regime really appeared to the Islamic leaders and organizations as a threat to the status of their institutions and their communities. Okay, and there's this kind of perception did not come out of nowhere. Right, there were prior efforts by Sukarno and even at independence in the 40s to kind of push back and force Islamic schools to kind of reduce the religious content of their curriculum. Okay. Now, in terms of what we can see today, in terms of our data, we're going to draw on data that Mashur was able to obtain from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. That tells us about the location and timing of Islamic school construction. Okay, so if we look today, this data is from 2019. If we look in 2019, there were about 53,000 madrasa, right? And from the curriculum data, which came from the SIAP website, again in 2019, we see that about a quarter of all instruction hours in madrasa are devoted to religious subjects, including the learning of Arabic. Okay. Now, in terms of pesantren, we see about 26,000 of them, and the pesantren are, of course, different in many ways from the madrasa. Again, I don't think I need to belabor those details for this audience. Now, in terms of secular schools, or what I'm calling secular schools, these are scola, right? These are the schools under the Ministry of Education. And there were about 220,000 of them in 2019, and a little over 3/4 were public, okay? The rest being private. Now, if we look at data, we see that there are this is administrative data from 2019 enrollment records. There's a little over 20% of students are enrolled in Islamic schools. You can see the enrollment rates are highest in Islamic schools at this junior secondary level, right, at middle school. Now, if we look at the IFLS, the numbers look very similar, but then when we look at Susanos, the numbers are a lot lower, right? And this is something we've puzzled over. We've talked to lots and lots of people and have what we think are, some explanations that can partially explain the underreporting. Pesantren enrollments are not reported in Susanos. But we've kind of scratched our heads and done lots and lots of things to make sure that this under-reporting of Islamic school attendance isn't biasing our results in any way. But we haven't come up with like a single explanation for why those numbers look so different. So I'd love to hear from all of you if you have any additional thoughts on that. There's some other data that we'll pull together. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of data is something we put together is effectively a qualitative oral history of Islamic schools that were built at the time in communities that were experiencing an influx of state funding and efforts to build este and preds. Okay, and this is very much has been very important for us as researchers to make sure that the way we're interpreting our regression results is actually borne out in practice in some of these communities. Okay, and let me just highlight briefly a couple of features of what we kind of learned. I mean, here's some details on the schools. This was in a district in West Sumatra and two in East Java. But let me just highlight a couple of kind of key things. One is that we did find a lot of evidence of in-pres schools and madrasa competing in different ways, right? Oftentimes deciding to build the schools very close together in order to kind of force parents to make a choice between one or the other, competing in terms of the time of the school day, in terms of the provision of free uniforms. And then we heard some strong anecdotes about the way that certain religious leaders were referring, even in Friday sermons, to these schools in very derisive terms. Of course, this is perhaps an extreme anecdote, but one that nevertheless illustrates the nature of the tensions between the state and organized Islamic education leaders. Okay, and then we heard lots of stories about pressure being put on local teachers in the madrasa by Golkar leaders in the community. And then finally, another really important thing we learned was how the Islamic sector financed this rapid expansion of their schooling system. Okay, it happened very quickly, as we'll see in a moment when we look at some results. And it happened through informal financing. Right? And in particular through informal taxation of rich individuals, but also lots and lots of small contributions from community members consolidated into a proper waqf endowment to support the construction of these schools and also the kind of recurring variable costs of maintenance and operation and personnel. Okay? Just some quotes from our respondents in that survey. Okay, so let me now, I'm gonna skip the details on our actual conceptual framework. It's just meant to kind of organize our results and our thinking about how to interpret those results. But I do want to highlight a couple of important features of the targeting. Like, where did the government build these schools? How did they decide where to build these schools? And so the first thing is that they followed a policy rule that Esther Duflo used empirically in her work. And that policy rule said we should allocate the more schools proportionally in places that had more students not currently enrolled in formal schools. Okay, according to what they were able to observe at the Kabupaten level in the 1971 population census. Okay, and so that they followed that rule pretty closely. Now, what people didn't realize until we have the data and ability to highlight this is that it also happened that in those places with more children not enrolled in school in 1971, there were more Islamic schools providing informal education outside of the proper state system at the time. Okay. And so what does that look like from the perspective of organized Islamic leaders? Well, it looks like the state is targeting areas where we have a stronger religious educational system. Okay. And so that's the perception that, would be a natural one, a natural inference to draw from the way that the policy rule is being implemented in practice. Okay. So let me skip through the model and turn now to some of the empirical results. Okay. So what we're going to do after I take a drink of water, we're going to set up a balance panel at the Kabupaten level, right? A balanced year by Kabupaten level panel. And we're going to look on the left-hand side at the number of Islamic schools that are built per 1,000 children in that Kabupaten. This is the normalization. It's fairly innocuous, and it's the one that Duflo and others have used. Okay, and then we're going to control for district fixed effects, year fixed effects, some other kind of measures associated with the way the program was being rolled out. We'll also control for the baseline presence of Islamic schools to kind of make sure we're capturing some variation that's distinct from the policy rule as we saw it in those graphs. And then we're going to ask, in places where more in-pres schools were being built, what was the response of the Islamic educational sector? Okay, this is a pretty standard kind of difference in difference with continuous variation in the number of schools being built per 1,000 kids after 1972. Okay, the equation seems to be missing a coefficient here or summation here. Apologies. But basically, so this is at the Kabupaten level. We're going to do the same thing at the desa level, because with the data we have from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the administrative data, we're able to know where within the Kabupaten that Islamic school was built and exactly in which year. Okay. And so we'll run a very similar kind of, in this case, it's a staggered difference in difference because Este Inpres are being built at different points in time between 1973 and 1978. Okay. So here's a snapshot of the kind of core results. Okay, there's a lot of secondary results, but we can basically learn the key lessons from these figures and the ones on the next slide. Okay, so what do we see? Well, we see prior to the introduction of Este Inpres in the 1960s and even in the very early 1970s, we see very little kind of evidence of pre-trends, suggesting that the government was not, they may have been building more schools in places with more Islamic schools, but they weren't building more Este Inpres in places that were seeing an increasing trend in Islamic school construction. Okay, and that's because the government, they really didn't have the data at the time to be able to very carefully understand what those trends look like. Okay, but then what happens right after the rollout of Este Inpres, you see a very quick, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, a very quick and rapid growth in Islamic school construction. This is summing up across all levels of education. Okay, that's at the Kabupaten level. And here's at the desa level. Okay, and what you can see is a very similar pattern. Okay, but now we're really kind of zooming in at the annual level, looking down at the very local desa level. And you see, even in the kind of immediate year in which an Este-Inpres was being built, you saw an increase in the likelihood of an Islamic school being built in that exact same desa. Okay, that grows over time and remains positive for the next decade. Okay, suggesting sustained growth in Islamic educational infrastructure in these communities. Okay, but now let's try and understand what's happening across different levels of education. Okay, so what you can see on the left is the outcome here is the construction of an Islamic elementary school, an ME, right? And you see for the first 6 years after an Este-Inpres is built, you see an increased likelihood of Madrasa Ibtidaiya being built in that same desa. Okay, and then it kind of falls down at year 7 after. Why does it fall down at year 7? Well, those kids will have graduated from the Madrasa Ibtidaiya, and then it will be time for them to go on to the Madrasa Sanawiya if they and their parents wanted to do that. And so that's precisely when you see a jump in the construction of MTS, right? Okay, Madrasa Sanawiya. Okay, and so this is the kind of pattern that shows up at the desa level, where it's much clearer than at the kind of coarser Kabupaten level. Okay, and then there's of course regression tables to bear out kind of the what basically tell us that our eyes aren't lying to us from those graphs. Okay. Here's a synthetic difference. And differences method that's basically a recent innovation in the way that difference in difference regressions handle departures from parallel trends. Okay, and this basically is just confirming that our standard kind of difference in difference estimates are not being confounded or biased by differential parallel trends. Okay, what about formalization? Right? So what's happening to the mix of formal and informal Islamic schools, right? Pesantren versus madrasa. Okay. And sorry, I should also mention, we also have data on Madrasa Diniya, right? Which we also consider as an informal Islamic school in this typology. Okay, and so what do you see? Well, you see right after the arrival of Este-Inpres, this is at the Kabupaten level, similar patterns at the desa level. You see, as a share of all Islamic, of all schools being built, you see a kind of a little bit of a dip in formal Islamic schools, right? But then it rises very quickly in the beginning in the late 1970s as we kind of accumulate exposure across many desa within each Kabupaten. And then in panel B, what you see is the share of informal Islamic schools as a share of all schools. Okay, and there you see a reduction in a pretty well sustained reduction in the likelihood of Islamic school construction, or informal Islamic school construction. Okay, so then the natural question is how did this how did this happen, right? Where did the resources come from? Okay, and so I mentioned our oral history, the qualitative work that we did talking to former founders of Islamic schools in affected communities. We learned a lot about how the rice harvests were very important in generating revenue to support the Waqf endowments necessary to kind of mobilize resources in the community and build Islamic schools. Okay. And I don't know how many of you remember the 1970s and what rice prices looked like, but it turned out that right at the arrival of Este-Inpres, rice prices were skyrocketing globally and of course locally as well. And so what that meant was that rice growing areas and big landowning elites in particular were experiencing a windfall in revenue at exactly the moment that Este-Inpres were being built in these communities. And what we learned from the oral history was that Islamic leaders in these communities were basically tapping on the shoulder of these elites and saying, share some of that windfall wealth with us. Okay, and so what we do in this table is basically look at an interaction of Este Impres being built in this community and a measure of how productive rice agriculture is in that village. Okay, and so you can see in row 2, strong, positive, and significant results suggesting that the Islamic educational sector response to Este Impres was stronger in communities with more exposure to this kind of windfall revenue from rice agriculture, and also in communities that had prior experience with Waqf endowments to mobilize community resources to support the building of Islamic educational infrastructure. Okay, skip that. Okay, so now on to curriculum, right? So we saw a supply side response at the extensive margin, building more schools. What about what was happening inside those schools and kind of the possibility that these newly built Islamic schools could differentiate their curriculum from the competitor schools being built by the state? Okay, and so what we're going to do here, this is a subset of schools in the SIOP database, and we know very detailed curriculum timetables. Okay, it's kind of really rich and interesting data. But basically what we do is run a very similar type of regression as before. And now what we're looking at, we're basically comparing in a kind of different sense, we're comparing Islamic schools being built before versus after the arrival of Este Impres in regions that were more versus less intensely exposed to school Este Impres construction. Okay. And so what do we find? Well, we find that Islamic schools built after Este Impres in more intensely exposed Kabupaten are increasing the time in which students are learning religious subjects by about, across all levels by about 1.2 additional hours as a share of all educational hours. Again, about 25% of educational hours in these madrasa are devoted to religious education. Okay, we're not seeing much difference in time spent on Pancasila and civic education, but we are seeing more time spent on learning the Arabic language and a bit less, especially at the junior secondary level, a bit less on time spent learning Bahasa Indonesia. Okay. So that's on the curriculum side. The data is not perfect, but it's some suggestive evidence that there's curriculum differentiation happening in response to state schools being built in your community. Okay. Okay, so that was the supply side. Now what I want to do, we have about 5 minutes left, is that right? Or 10, 5, 10? Ooh. Okay, good. So now what I want to do, we saw the supply side, right? Schools being built. What about the demand side? What are parents and their children now deciding to do in terms of their schooling decisions, right? They now have more options to choose between Islamic and state schools. And so what do we see? And so here we're going to run the exact same specification that Duflo runs. But instead of looking at total years of education, which is what she was able to measure with SUPAS and data from 1995, now we're going to look at Islamic school choices, okay? And so the comparison here is comparing children who are aged 2 to 6 years old at the time of the rollout of Este Impres compared to children who are 12 to 17 in the same location, who, of course, by virtue of that older age, had already passed through the elementary education system. Okay, and so that's the one difference. And then the other difference is across Kabupaten that had more versus less Este Impres being built in their communities. Okay, so that's the specification. You can actually see the regression patterns in the raw data. Okay, and so what we're doing here is just plotting in solid black line. We're plotting across birth cohorts from 1967 to 1987. We're plotting the share of students or the share of people who were born in each of those years who were who had completed Islamic elementary schooling. Okay, and so the dark black line is districts, kabupaten, that are above the median in terms of SD and Pres construction. The dashed lines are kabupaten that are below the median. Okay, and so you can see this pattern before the rollout of SD in Pres, which would have happened here, basically for cohorts that were basically aged 2 to 6 in this range. You can see kind of before that, they're pretty parallel trends. Of course, as we saw very early on, the way the policy rule worked was that more schools were being built in places where there was more Islamic education. That's why this line is above that line. And then what you see is that the lines come very close together for those cohorts that were exposed, that were aged 2 to 6, right? That's that reduction in elementary Islamic education, because now a lot of parents for the first time have the option to send their kids to SD and Pres. Okay, then you see it ratchet back up here because there's now that supply side response. There's more ME being built in these communities, and now parents, parents and kids have that option. Okay, that's on the elementary side. But then look at the junior secondary side. Those same cohorts who are seeing a reduction in the likelihood of attending Islamic elementary are now seeing a sharp increase in the likelihood of attending Madrasa Sanawiyah. Okay, and that's exactly the kind of pattern we saw, if you remember in those graphs, the kind of pattern that we saw in terms of Islamic school construction. There was a kind of short run, temporary kind of lull in building ME, and then a quick kind of rapid response in building the Islamic secondary madrasa. Okay, so again, regression tables are just bearing that out. You see a reduction in the likelihood of attending Islamic elementary as your final level of education, and an increase in the likelihood of attending Islamic junior secondary, as well as Madrasa Aliyah if you're going to continue on to high school. Okay, skip that. And then here is basically an event study type of regression where we're basically highlighting the patterns in a kind of proper panel specification that we saw in the raw data plots earlier. Okay, these are just the regression coefficients for each cohort. Okay, let me skip that. Sorry, it's a bit garbled. We do see, let me just highlight one point. It's hard to see here. I'm not sure, the PDF got a little scrambled. But basically one really interesting thing that we saw was that at the junior secondary level, it seems like attendance at Islamic schools was stronger for girls than for boys. Okay, and one important thing that was happening in the early 1980s at the time that parents were making these decisions with their children was that the government banned the wearing of hijab in public schools. And so we actually have some evidence in the appendix showing that for the small sample of kind of women on the margin of kind of moving between primary and junior secondary school, you see a shift of girls, especially in conservative communities, from sekolah to madrasa. Okay. Okay, in the last few minutes, let me just highlight some of the kind of findings on the kind of downstream implications of this school competition between religious and state schools. Okay, and so we basically ask, how did this competition affect identity and broader kind of measures of nation building? Okay, and so the first kind of striking thing to us, at least, was that this program, unlike many others throughout history and in a lot of other contexts, did not seem to win many votes for the ruling party. And if anything, we see that in communities in Kabupaten, where more SD Inpres were being built, we actually saw a reduction in the vote share for Golkar from 1971 to the 1977 election. Okay, and that's pretty striking. Some of that vote went to P3, which was the main opposition party at the time. There was also the PDIP, but P3 was the largest opposition party. And they were able to capture some of those votes from that otherwise, in the absence of Este Impres, would have gone to Golkar. Okay, how did they do that? Well, it must have had some potential role played by Islamic schools, right? And Islamic leaders of those schools mobilizing the vote against the state, against the ruling party, right? Why do we think it's from leaders and kind of parents of children and not children themselves? In those early elections in 77 and 82, the kids who were going to school had not yet become voting age, right? That would only have happened in the election beginning in 87 and really 92, but we don't see we see a pretty quick response. And remember what was happening at the time. The government between 1971 and the 77 election basically forced there were 5 Islamic political parties at the time, forced them to consolidate under P3, and some of them didn't want to do that. And so that actually, I think, depressed turnout in some areas. But nevertheless, among those who were turning out in high Impres regions, you do see an increase in support for P3. It's not huge, but it is meaningful. Okay. What about piety? And so maybe we'll end on this result. Basically, what we're asking. Let's focus on panel B. It's a small survey, but it's one that covers 144 kabupaten in Indonesia. It's conducted by some political scientists, Tom Popinski and a set of Indonesian co-authors, and asks very detailed questions about religious practice. Okay, and what we can see, using the same specification, individual level specification, comparing across exposed and non-exposed cohorts in high versus low Impres regions, you see for those who are more exposed to school competition, more likely to go to Islamic schools, you see an increase in some religious practices, not all of them, but you do see an increase in engagement with the Quran, with prayer in both prayer in attendance at Friday prayer, praying 5 times a day, and then aggregating those up into an index, we see they're about 7.8 percentage points more likely to engage in a set of religious practices off of a base of about 42% of these 7 practices. Okay, so that's what we find in terms of individuals exposed. We have some other results on support for Pancasila. We don't see much. We see there's some questions about objective support for various forms of Sharia law, and you don't see any sort of response there. So we're not talking about a shift in religious political preferences. We're seeing a shift in piety, right? For those kids who are attending, many of whom were attending Islamic schools. We have some other results on legislative candidates in the 2019 election. For exposed cohorts, they're more likely to be running on P3 tickets as opposed to running with Golkar. Okay, this is for DPR, DPRD candidates in 2019. Okay, so just to kind of sum up and ask what it all means, I think one reading of this paper is that there was backlash, right? This was a time of intense confrontation between the secularizing regime of President Suharto in the 1970s and organized Islam, right? And some of this confrontation was happening in the political arena. Some of it was happening in the legislative arena. There was confrontation in the court system. There was a controversial marriage law that was interpreted as an affront to religious marital norms, and of course in education. Okay, so there was potentially backlash, right? But that's not to say that this competition was not in the end potentially welfare, right? Because in a way, the Islamic education sector was really filling a void left by the state. Why wasn't the regime also building SMP and SMA to kind of capture those recently graduating SD students? Well, they were in, they had plans, they built a lot of these schools, but they also ran out of money, right? Because what happened to oil prices in the early 1980s collapsed. So all the oil revenue that was financing development programs, including SD Impres and other programs, it really dried up very abruptly. And so they weren't able to build enough SMP and enough SMA to capture those newly graduating SD students. Okay. So the Islamic schools filled that void and really complemented the state's effort to expand primary education. And you put that competition together and you see an increase in overall levels of education, right? And so this dual education system that Indonesia has and has had for many years, which is quite unique, I should say, in the Muslim world and even beyond, it really in some ways has complemented each other and been a force for elevating years of education in this country. Okay. So just to sum up, this program, SD Impres, is one that's been studied a lot by economists. And we revisited it with new data and a kind of new perspective and insights on the historical institutional context. And with that, we were able to highlight some short-term effects on changes in religious school choice. We were able to characterize dynamic effects on education markets because of the ability to track the kind of supply of religious schools. And we were able to kind of highlight some pretty suggestive evidence in terms of the long-term effects on religious identity and practice. Okay, and just to sum up, the findings, the competition from Islamic schools increased post-primary schooling opportunities, but may have kind of counteracted some of the objectives of the Suharto regime and the New Order objectives of nation building. Okay. And also, of course, ensured the resilience of this very strong and unique dual education system in Indonesia. And I should note that this contrasts with many other contexts where a rapidly secularizing state engaged in mass schooling program. Okay, if you look at, for example, the very well-known cases of France and Turkey in the early, in France in the late 1800s and Turkey in the early 1900s, they were able to really displace religious schools and really shift the country in a more secular direction, right? That didn't happen here. It didn't happen in a few other places. But we don't really have much empirical evidence in a kind of comparative sense to add this all up. Okay, and so hopefully this is one additional piece in that enduring puzzle. Thank you very much. I really look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your presentations. It feels like we're on the time machine when we look at the pictures there before. So if I could reflect from the my experience, actually I'm a product of the intergenerational transmissions of religious values. So I was attending, I attend Islamic primary schools. So I make my son also attend Islamic primary schools.
Great.
But now we have Pelajar Pancasila in the curriculum. So the Islamic religious schools also have this, what we call Pancasila things. So if I could sum up also the what Sam has presented, the study actually covers quantitative and qualitative aspects, right? So for the quantitative aspect, we found that the implementations of SD Impres actually increased the number of religious schools and also increased the religious identity in Indonesia. And then the qualitative study, we see that the recollections of the history and tensions, right, in the community between choosing the schools decisions. So we will begin our Q&A sessions. I will give the opportunity to participants who are at the SMERU office, and then to the participants who join via Zoom. So for the first Q&A sessions, I will invite two participants. One is Pak Asep. And don't forget to mention your name, affiliations, and followed by questions or any comments, thought that you would like to make in today's discussions, or perhaps recollections of what you experienced about religious education. So I think for the first participant is Pasep and others. Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Riri. Thanks, Sams. Very, very interesting paper. I have three short comments. One's on the large difference in the rate of attendance in Islamic school between IFLS and Susanas. Have you ruled out the possibility of students attending both schools? Yeah, I remember when I was in the primary school in the morning, I also attended Madrasah Diniyah in the afternoon. At that time, I was asked, where do you go to study? I will answer, I will go to Sekolah Dasar. But if I was asked, do you attend primary school and do you attend madrasah? I will say yes to both. That's the first one. The second one, on the demand side, do you take into account the welfare level of the family, of the students? I had an opportunity to live in a village where there were both Sekolah Dasar and Madrasah, and I noticed that the background of the students are rather different. Yeah, the students from wealthier families will tend to go to the Sekolah Dasar, and the students from the poorer families will tend to go to the madrasah. My last comment, I wonder if you have any comment based on your study with the recent controversy of the draft law on the national education system, which has removed madrasah, from the national education system. What's your comment on it? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Asep. All great questions and comments. Let me start from the first one. This is our leading hypothesis as to why there's underreporting in Susanas, but we still don't quite understand why that same kind of underreporting wouldn't show up in IFLS. Perhaps they were better about asking, but I don't think you could respond yes to both in the IFLS. And so we still have that puzzle, but exactly what you described, Mashur, in fact, did the same thing. So he would go to, I believe, SD in the morning and then madrasa in the afternoon, right? And that's, of course, I think a very common thing. It was maybe even more common back then. So that's certainly an important explanation. I wish we had better kind of systematic data to characterize that. If anyone has power over BPS and can tell them, make sure you allow for yeses to both of those in the future, that would be amazing, and I would be forever indebted to you. The second comment on the demand side, yes, I think you see this in Susanas. Richer families tend to be sending their kids to SD, and relatively poorer ones in the same community sending their kids to madrasa. I don't have the sense that that would necessarily change our interpretation of what we're finding, but it would certainly explain why. For example, we learned in the oral history in some of these communities that the madrasa were providing free uniforms at a time when parents were, in some places, parents were having to pay for uniforms for their kids to go to SD. And so I think there was competition on that margin, which might have resulted in a different type of family sending their kids to madrasa versus sekolah. Finally, on the draft law, that's very interesting. I need to learn more about that. this is the same kind of thing that happened in the early 1970s. There was a lot of kind of give and take about, whether madrasa should be part of the national education system or something distinct. I'm not sure, how at the moment, how to take our findings and apply them to that debate. But maybe next week, after I've read a bit more about the draft law, I can come back to you and give you some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Bayu, and I have a couple of questions. The first one is regarding to Golkar party, the number of votes gained by Golkar in opposition to P3. Have your research considered the obligations of civil servants, PNS, to vote? And the uplifting of that obligations during reformasi might contribute to the decrease of Golkar's vote in opposition to P3. The second one is regarding to the motivations. Was it a purely religious motivation? So those parents sent their children to religious school, or was it much more influenced by economic and structural factors? The third question is regarding to provinces in Indonesia. In which provinces on what island are the inclinations to join religious schools higher? And fourthly, the most sensitive, I think, is does your research have any recommendations for the government of Indonesia in relation to education and inter-religious harmony currently in this era? Thank you.
Thank you, Bayu. Those were great questions. On the Golkar vote, that's interesting. I'm not sure how to think about it in this context, other than, if the number of PNS in these areas, like if it varied with the construction of Este Infres, then I think we would have to kind of worry about that. But I'm not sure there's kind of a systematic reason why that would be the case once we account for the district fixed effects and the population of children, which is also one of the controls. So I think we're kind of okay there. We did hear a lot in the oral history conversations we had. We heard a lot about pressure from Golkar officials in the villages or from the Kepala Desa when they were Golkar party men, putting pressure on the teachers in the madrasa to really vote for Golkar and to become part of Guppy, which was an organization, a state-run organization for Islamic educators. So I think that the politics were there. I'm not sure how to think kind of how the PNS vote would have really changed our interpretation. On the religious versus economic motivations, that's a great question, and it's very similar to what Pa Asep just mentioned about relatively poor children going to madrasa, where the costs might be different. We actually don't see today, I should have mentioned this, we actually don't see in Susanas, you don't see differences, at least significant ones, between educational expenses by households who are sending their kids to Islamic schools versus households that are sending their kids to Skola. So at least today, in the 2010s, there doesn't seem to be a big difference in the costs. Maybe there was back then, but again, we don't have strong evidence of that, and moreover, I think the kind of consequences of exposure to religious education may have been similar across high and low income individuals, but our hands are tied a bit. In terms of which regions, do you see kind of stronger effects and stronger responses in terms of religious school choice? One result I skipped over, but I can just describe in words, is if you take the vote share for Islamic parties in the 1950s, there was an election in 1955 an election that was canceled kind of halfway through in 1957, local elections, and you sum up the vote share for the various Islamic parties, those were the last elections before 1971, before the new order. That gives us a good sense of like what religious, variation in religious preferences, at least politically, looked like. And what we see is that it's in the regions with a stronger Islamic vote share in the 1950s, you saw a stronger response to Este Impres, with kids shifting into Islamic schools. And so, where are those parties stronger in the 1950s? In a lot of the same places they're strong today, in terms of the geography of the Islamic political vote. West Java, certainly, pockets elsewhere in East Java, and then West Sumatra, of course, a few parts of Kalimantan, South Sulawesi, some of these places. The last question is the hardest to answer. It's again related to this draft law that I need to read and have a more informed opinion of. But I do think, our results do highlight the value of this dual education system. At least historically, it has elevated levels of education. It has created post-primary educational opportunities that otherwise would not have been there because the state was financially constrained and unable to build enough secondary schools to meet the demand for continued education. Okay, and so I think, it's important to kind of continue having those conversations, to continue navigating any sort of tensions between the Ministry of Religious Affairs and the Ministry of Education. But all of this is, of course, incumbent on national political leadership, which, as I heard a lot more over lunch with Pa Asep, is in flux at the moment, and we'll see kind of how things look next year after the election. Sorry, that wasn't a very definitive answer, but I'm towing the line.
Okay, so we're still in the first session, I guess. Zoom session. So we have Pa Abdul Malik. I think Pa Abdul Malik is from Kemendikbud, who would like to raise questions directly. Okay. Hello. So.
Hello. Can
Yeah.
everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. That's I really appreciate this. First of all, let me raise my appreciation to this study. It's intriguing. It's really interesting to read. But I just would like to give comments on not on the sort of construct of the model and quantitative analysis, but rather on the side issues probably regarding the implicit assumption, particularly pertaining to the association between the Islamic school, if you want to say madrasah, and the ideological affiliation. As I read your paper sort of rapidly this morning, I feel that it's a bit too simplistic about that. Looks like that you need to kind of revisit that and see whether or not how to see how accurate your assumption is. But before that, I would like to say that the when you make comparison between the religious subject teaching in madrasah and the teaching on state ideology, Pancasila, and Bahasa Indonesia, the national language, etc. Probably that's something that you need to look at it again. First of all, since the mid of 1970s, there was a joint decree between Ministry of Religious Affairs, Ministry of Education and Culture, and Ministry of Internal Affairs, Home Affairs, saying that essentially the madrasah follow the same curriculum as the general school. We call it general school, not state school, because state school is to denote the public school. Anyway, so essentially the number of hours of instruction for state ideology is no difference between madrasah and the general school. There is no difference. What is difference is that you are right when you said that the hours of religious instruction is more in madrasah compared to the general schooling. But as far as the state ideology instruction, they're all the same, because that's the national curriculum. That is stated in national curriculum. So they cannot give less than that. Okay. Now, having said that, I must also add that with the more hours of religious instruction in madrasah compared to the religious instruction in general school, I must say convincingly that the effect on the ideological association is less worrisome, if you would like to use that term, in madrasah compared to in the general schools. For your information, about 10 years ago, I was managing a technical assistance project funded by EU and TFAT, managed by ADB. We did some sort of exercise and implement program to improve the religious teaching in schools, but not in madrasah. And in the background was, we want the religious instruction to be more inclusive, more moderate, to make it much better for the national building, for the nation building. So we focus on the schools, assuming that the religious instruction in madrasah are very much safe. They have more hours, and they tend to be more moderate compared to the religious attitude in the state school, if you like. So that's the situation, and you may also refer to a number of research that's done previously, that the what is more worrying actually is the sort of student activities, religious activities in the general school compared to in madrasah. And besides that, you may also check the sort of media and other publication to see the instances in which students refuse to bow to the flag, red and white, and to refuse to sing the national anthem. That has never happened in madrasah, but it happens sporadically in the general schools. So that's the situation. You may also need to consult the TFAT, who supported the improvement of madrasah and the Islamic school in general, to see what sort of characteristic of school that refuse the assistance from the international agencies. Those are not madrasah, but private Islamic integrated school. Those are the things. So what I'm trying to say is that the hotbed of hardliner radicalism, whatever, if you were to push it further, it's not madrasah, but general schools. And that's also very true at the higher education level. I must assure you that the instances of radicalism is not in the EIN and UIN, the religious school under higher education institution under Ministry of Religious Affairs, but in the universities under Ministry of Education and Culture, particularly in the field of science and engineering. So this may appear as counterintuitive, but that's what it is, you know. So again, I just want to kind of give you feedback on this, and perhaps that would kind of smooth, sort of realign your this very interesting work into the sort of reality. So please really work on rechecking the behavioral assumption, and see with that all, then I would believe your contribution is going to be more meaningful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Abdul Malik from Kemendikbud. Sam, do you talk to?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pa. Those were really helpful insights. You're right that, you know, a lot of what we have to do in this type of paper is simplify things, and in the process of simplifying, we end up losing a lot of the nuance that your comments helpfully brought out. Thank you for that. You've given us something, you know, you've given me something to think about, and you know, I certainly agree with a lot of what you're saying. And if we had better data from the 1970s and 80s on curriculum, I think we would be able to highlight a lot of the nuance that you're pointing out. And certainly, you know, in more recent years, there's been a lot of kind of changes in the nature of religious education inside Sekolah, and especially in the last, you know, 10, 20 years. And that's really beyond the scope of what we're doing empirically, but would be interesting to kind of think about how some of those changes have come about, you know, on kind of the same, out of the same trajectory that we're studying in the period we're focused on. But thank you very much for those comments. We'll definitely think about them and incorporate some of your insights.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next question, still from the Q&A from the Zoom. Do you want to choose?
Yeah. Yeah, let me answer Lolita's question, or do
Yeah.
It's okay if I just read it?
Yeah,
or-
it's
yeah.
okay.
Okay. Unless should we? I don't. How do you want to proceed? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want
Okay,
them
so
to read it? Do you want me to read it? I'm
there's the
happy.
questions from Lolita Morena. Her questions is, since Islamic junior school enrollment increased and you seem to argue a support for Islamic ideology, how does that relate to the theory that values instilled in younger age, primary school, is more important than older age, the junior, secondary, and upper one?
Hi, Lolita. That's a great question. It's something that we've thought a lot about, and especially because we find much stronger kind of response at the junior secondary level. I think it turns out that I think you're highlighting the kind of impressionable years hypothesis, that at different points in your young life, you're more prone to kind of having your preferences changed and shaped than at other ages. And it turns out that the kind of evidence base for the impressionable years hypothesis is a bit weaker than I think than a lot of us had thought until very recently. And I think, you know, one possibility is that indeed, you know, religious like piety might be especially important in terms of how that's shaped at the junior high school age, when you're really kind of become more conscious of religious practice and what its, its importance. In terms of political ideology, I think the thinking is that it's happened, that comes later, a little bit later, like in high school in particular. And given that rates of high school education and Islamic high school education in particular in the 1970s and 80s was still much lower than it is today, I think, I think that explains why we're not seeing much of an impact on ideology per se, as opposed to religious piety. But it's a good question, and one we've thought a little bit about, but we should perhaps think more. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to continue to the second Q&A sessions for the offline participants. Don't forget to mention.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Sam. My name is Rashesh Shrestha, and I've actually cited some of my papers in my research, so happy to be here and in your seminar. So I guess my question is a bit technical, and I guess, and it may be slightly convoluted, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense, but from best what I remember about the interest data, the data is actual school construction at the district level, right? It's the historical record of school construction. But it seems like the religious school data that you have actually is based on schools that are in operation in 2019, and you go back and check when they were constructed. So I'm imagining a situation where there might have been school constructed back in the day that did not survive until 2019, and perhaps there is some dynamics correlated with the construction of the schools of the interest schools that would have affected the survival probabilities of those Islamic schools. So I can imagine, for example, if the Islamic school construction was even throughout, but because of the human capital effect, they were able to survive because they got more donations in the areas that also got the interest schools, then the likelihood of survival will be higher there. And you would see that correlation that you have seen in the construction of schools, the religious and I was just wondering if there's a way to sort of account for that in your regression, whether I don't know if your fixed effects takes care of that, or if there's a dynamic that needs to be sort of dealt with in some other way. So anyways, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question about kind of systematic attrition of schools from the data. We have a snapshot of schools that are in existence in 2019. And so, we were worried a lot about this. I think the kind of most reassuring thing that we were able to do was use potency data, POTUS data from the 1980s that tells us about the 1980s that tells us about the stock of Islamic schools built in that decade. Like it's not a flow of school construction, but we can see at multiple points in time, at least for the Madrasa Ibtidaiya, and we see a very similar pattern. We haven't kind of done the very direct kind of quantitative comparisons, but maybe we should, to kind of make sure that this point you're highlighting can't account for the entire pattern of trajectory of results. But it's a great question, and it would be great if we had administrative data from an earlier point in time as well. But it is an important possibility, and the POTUS data help, but are not kind of perfect. But thank you. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Nadia. I'm master student in Universitas Indonesia. Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I have a question. From the research, it can be implied that Islamic schools did not teach Pancasila and civic education as much as mass public schools. So is it reasonable and feasible enough to investigate the impact of being enrolled in Islamic school rather than enrolled in mass public schooling on civic engagement and tolerance level in later life? Because I think IFLS can accommodate this kind of research question. And I see you have investigated this crowding effect of secular subject on human capital formation. And how about on social capital in later life? Because you did on the human capital formation. I mean, this can be a future research development, for example. I know this may be beyond the scope of your study, but I want to know. And what do you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. That was a great question. And it's something that I think we'd love to look at. And I just want to mention one thing that actually relates back to Pa Abdul Malik's comment from earlier, which is that we didn't see a change in Pancasila civic education hours for Islamic schools built before versus after INPREZ and high versus low INPREZ regions. And so that doesn't seem to be a big margin of difference in terms of the allocation of classroom time. And that also might explain why we're not seeing big differences in exposed cohorts views towards Pancasila as opposed to views towards Sharia. We're just not seeing big differences in terms of ideology, right? Political ideology. What we did see was big shifts in piety and religiosity. And so I think your question is a good one, whether we can also look at interreligious tolerance, look at civic engagement and social capital. The IFLS is probably the best place to do that. And like so many other questions where you're looking at spatial variation across the entire country of Indonesia, it's often difficult to get a big enough sample from the IFLS to be able to kind of have power to test some of these need hypotheses. And so, we've got some results from the IFLS on human capital in the appendix, but the samples are so small that and the kind of regional coverage is so limited that we're a little worried about extrapolating too far. But we should look at some of these other questions because maybe we have more power there. But that's, it's a nice suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Nadia. We are going to answer questions from the Zoom chat. So we have a question from Dia Prita Drajati. It is interesting that you explore the effect on piety. Did you also look at how affects gender segregations? Also, did you see any variations between urban or rural?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dia. We have not looked at like gender attitudes and gender norms, but that would be another interesting thing to look at for future work. And I think, I'm trying to think. I think the IFLS would probably be, again, the best place to kind of look at some of those outcomes. But we could also look perhaps at like female labor force participation. If your husband was exposed to this competition, this school competition in the 70s, it's a nice idea. I think it's also something we could look at. And then in terms of the urban rural, I don't know that we've done that to the extent that the only thing I'm thinking is that it might be captured in the variation in the policy rule that said that, to the extent that urban areas had more kids enrolled and hence fewer INPREZ schools in the 1970s, I think it might be already in our analysis implicitly, but we could look. So it's a nice suggestion. Thank you.
Next questions. I think it's from Raya. Why do you view Islamic educations or madrasah and sekolah non-madrasah as two mutually exclusive entities? Do you include the state madrasah as Islamic school even if it's established by the Suharto government? Raya mentioned that since 1980s, even the non-madrasah schools have adopted increasing religious stand, especially in contested Islamic regions. So non-madrasah school is not necessarily the opposite of Islamic education.
Yeah, thank you, Raya. This echoes a lot of what Pa Abdul Malik mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, I guess one thing we were able to do, there are a lot of sekolah that have very clear Islamic signals in their names. And there are a lot of sekolah Muhammadiyah, for example, And then some other schola that have names that are obviously like very evocative of the Islamic faith. And so, what we've done is basically separate out those schools, which we think are the more religiously oriented schola, and try to see if there were different responses from those schools. And we don't see much difference in terms of their entry after Este Impres. But you're right that there are a lot of schola that are potentially not that distinct from madrasa, especially in some of these more conservative or contested regions. And so we're ultimately limited by the data we have, but do our best to kind of highlight the rich heterogeneity within the schola, at least from what we can see in their names, to the extent that the name is signaling something, something beyond the fact that they're also under the Ministry of Education. And then, yes, you're right that about 8% of the madrasa are public, right? They're public madrasa. Some of them were built by the Suharto government, some of them built after Suharto. And we don't see much of a response to Este Impres from those public madrasa, which is intuitive because they're being built by the same state that is building the Este Impres, and so they're not going to build them both in the same community in kind of crowd each other out, at least from what we see in the data. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Sam. And I think we have two related questions. So this is about the Muhammadiyah schools or NU schools, how it influenced the decisions to choose Islamic school then as they impress back then. And then, so this is questions from Fadil Aribo.
Yeah, thank you, Fadil. It's a good question. Do parents? Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't know because we're using modern Susanos data from 2012 onward. We don't know the education of your parents, right? We know your education, but these people in 2012, 2013, who were of primary school age in the 1970s, their parents, many of them, even if they're alive, are not living with them. And so unfortunately, we're not able to highlight that. The only thing we are able to do is what I mentioned earlier in response to Bayu's question, which is measure across regions, places with more versus less support in the 1950s for Islamic political parties. And so in that case, we do see a stronger response in terms of Islamic school choice after Este Impres arrived in your community. And so I think your intuition is probably right. But again, we're constrained to do that at the individual level.
Thank you, Sam. So we actually still have more time. So we could open another sessions of Q&A for the offline participants at the SMERU's office. Is there any questions? Okay. So while we wait for the questions from the offline participants, we could also, I think it's from Dedi Fash Mahdi. I think he just make comments about the Muhammadiyah Islamic schools. It says that bring internalizations being national building Pancasila value actually.
Yeah, so we did try to look at Sekolah Muhammadiyah, which we do see in the data from the Ministry of Education and Culture, and we didn't see much of a difference in terms of their entry in response to Este Impres. So it doesn't seem to be following the same pattern as the private madrasa that are entering as we saw.
So perhaps because the Muhammadiyah also use the Pancasila value, that's why we don't find any difference. Okay, and then another questions in the Zoom chat is from Yuriko Nakajima. So in Duflo studies, the analysis of the effects of Impres on primary education is well known. And as for the efforts of the government to increase the number of registered school by adding some subjects stipulated in the study guidelines to the Islamic school curriculums, how are they reflected or not in the curriculum or shown in the result. I think quality might be the difference as long as the proposed is different.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we don't have data on the curriculum in Scola. Our understanding is that the curriculum within Scola tend to be much more homogeneous, although, you know, as we heard from Pa Abdul Malik earlier, there's probably a lot more variation now in the more recent period. But at least historically, our understanding is that the kind of heterogeneity in curriculum within the Scola is much narrower than the heterogeneity within the Islamic education sector. And so, yeah, I think you're onto something, but my hunch is that it's not going to be kind of a first order source of variation in quality across Scola of different in different villages. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Rico. We still have a lot of questions actually in the Zoom chat. Do we have any questions from the offline participant? Okay, is it okay to answer us? I think we still have questions from Ilmiawan Awalin from University of Erlangga. So yeah, what is your insight on the rise of Sekolah Islam, SD Islam, SMP Islam in the past decades?
Yeah, this is a good question, and you know, I know there are also Sekolah Terpadu Islam, I think, that are you know, have arisen in the post Suharto era. So there have been a lot of innovations in the among Sekolah in the last 20 years. We haven't looked at them empirically yet, in part because it's pretty far beyond the period of the 1970s. And you know, while there could certainly be a legacy of the Este Impres activities in the 1970s, you know, that kind of stretches the limits of what we can do in a kind of causal identification sense. And so we've been a little bit reluctant to explore that. But the conversation we've had here from several of the audience online and offline makes me think, you know, we should do a little bit to look at some of this more recent changes in the education system and see if we can kind of trace it back to what was happening in the 70s. Nice ideas.
Okay. Next questions is from Parmawati Malik from BRIN. What do you think about the education, the leaderships? Yeah, so the leaderships. So perhaps in terms of ideology or the leaderships in the current days, how do you reflect to the current situations? So leaderships in terms of perhaps schooling? Perhaps?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it would be interesting to kind of ask who are, you know, the leaders in the Islamic education system today, and some of the kind of leading forces in that sector, like what their education looked like in the 1970s and 80s, right? And whether they themselves were exposed to some of this school competition that you know, that is at the core of what we're doing empirically. If there was data to do that, I would love to be able to explore some of that. That's a nice idea.
Okay. Yeah, so actually Ibu Parmawati also asked a questions before that. It's about which province or regions that represent the national identity that was appropriate for Indonesia, perhaps from your study.
That's a good question. I'm not sure we have the data to really answer that, other than what we could see from, you know, voting patterns in the 1950s, but that's a bit of a stretch, because in some ways national identity was still a little bit in flux at that time, and the different parties had different visions and interpretations of what the nation itself, its identity was meant to be. That of course evolved through the 1960s and into the 70s, and I guess is still evolving today. But yeah, food for thought. Thank you.
Okay, we still have one more questions in the Zoom chat. So from Yeni Anggreni, many Islamic boarding schools in Indonesia are not registered with EMIS and the PODIC. So these students are categorized as out-of-school children. What do you think the existence of this religious school has contributed to the increasing number of children not attending school?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think certainly the pesantren. So we do know we do have data, administrative data on pesantren from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. You can actually, they have a very nice website where you can actually see school by school. And one piece of data that they report is the number of students. And so from that, you can actually get a good sense of the number of students enrolled in pesantren. But and I don't quote me on this, but I think it's something on the order of 7 million students. But if you look at this household survey data, if you look at Susanas, those students, I believe, are reported, many of them, unless they're going to madrasa as well, are reported as not going to school at all, which would be another explanation for why Susanas underreports Islamic school attendance.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we have another questions from Zoom, but perhaps Sam, do you have any interesting story behind this paper? So it's like old is gold. So the data is very quite old. So how do you make up from this study actually?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there were really two things that kind of happened at the same time that made this paper possible and kind of got us thinking about it. One is Mashur was a student in my second year PhD class. And we talked about the Duflo paper, and Mashur wanted to revisit the Duflo analysis, think a bit more about what the measure of Este Inprez construction, like what it was capturing, how reliable it was, and kind of revisit some of her analysis. And so right when he was doing that, Ben and I were working on a study, which some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, I encourage you to take a look at it, and of course send me thoughts if you have any. A study looking at the 1960s land reform that Sukarno implemented, and trying to understand how that attempted land reform led to, in effect, an increase in Waqf endowed institutions in Indonesia, as large landholders were trying to shield their properties from expropriation as part of the land reform by transferring it into Waqf status in the hands of local Islamic leaders and organizations. And so one thing that did was increase the number of pesantren, increase the entry of pesantren, construction of pesantren in the 1960s, 70s, and thereafter. And so, we got to thinking that was exactly at the time in the 1970s when Este Inprez was being implemented. And so we wondered if there might be a kind of interesting possibility that Este Inprez was changing the religious education market. And so we brought Mashur and Ben and sat around the table and started brainstorming about what we might be able to do to really shed light on this very fascinating episode of mass schooling that economists have done a lot of good economic research on, but we're kind of missing the political economy that that was clear to Ben and I after we had spent so much time thinking about the conflict in the 1960s.
Okay, that's an interesting. So the land reform study is also already finished, or
Yes, yeah. It's called the Institutional Foundations of Religious Politics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, so we have another questions in the Zoom chat. It's from Muhammad Najib. We should acknowledge the shift happened in madrasa in the past is associated with political parties such as NU and Mashumi that attempt to formalize Sharia, thus making the government suspicious of madrasa. But today, madrasa and pesantrens are more moderate with their managers of NU and Muhammadiyah background being supportive to national ideology. Okay, this is perhaps just a thought from Muhammad Najib. Do you have some
Yeah,
reflections?
thank you, Mohammed. This is a great observation and one that that certainly emerged from from our own research. I think I know the work you're highlighting by Bakhtiar Effendi, and I'm not sure if we cite it in the paper, but it's certainly I'm certainly aware of this context and kind of the shift of NU and Muhammadiyah into really supporting the state objectives in terms of Panchasila in ways that their predecessors, and in particular Masyumi, and the remnants of Masyumi as part of NU in the 1970s were, were certainly, we're certainly a very different organized religious political force than the NU and Muhammadiyah of the 1980s and beyond. But thank you for that observation.
Okay. So I think we still have more to. Oh, okay. Yeah, Rash.
No, please.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on the literature on sort of, I guess, nation building in the economics, within the economics, especially as they are done through mass schooling. Because this is the research that I'm doing in the context of Nepal, especially after democratization, when there's a political change and the political party wants to build the nation, they do it through mass schooling, right? And I know that Professor Alissina's paper is sort of one of the key references on that. That's in 2019. And have you seen a sort of growth in that literature? And where do you see the literature sort of going forward? What are some sort of big questions, I guess, that could be answered? Just curious, because I'm also working in the similar space. So just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the short answer is that there's a lot of rich work by historians and political scientists. But there's not a whole lot of like very kind of frontier empirical research using kind of frontier methods of causal inference. And so I think, I think the activity in this literature, there's a few recent papers in Turkey, for example. There's some recent work revisiting the well-known kind of French case. But in general, there's not a lot of research. And I think, what we know about mass schooling and nation building really comes from careful work by historians. And so I think, what we don't know is kind of how much of the contribution to nation building is actually coming from the education itself inside the schools, in terms of the specific curriculum, in terms of what the teachers' backgrounds look like, as opposed to broader shifts in society that are happening at the same time for reasons unrelated to education. And so I would say, like, every country is going to have its own unique history of mass schooling and nation building. But I would imagine that, there's a lot of scope to do very similar type of work as we did here in country by country. And in doing that, there's probably going to be a lot of nuances that are going to raise new possibilities for research. But in terms of like specific directions and questions, it's a good question. I'm a little hard pressed to come up with specific ones on the spot, but I think in part that's because I don't think there's just not a big body of work to kind of highlight like what the obvious next step is. There is one thing I would say, and this is also applies to our work. As empiricists, we often like to measure mutually exclusive outcomes. Do you have a secular ideology? Are you religious? Right? But they're never mutually exclusive in practice. We're all very complex individuals. We have, we can have overlapping identities. We can have kind of complementarities between those different identities. We're not simplistic human beings, right? In terms of, having a kind of single homogeneous identity, right? But unfortunately, there's just not a lot of data that ask like, about these. They ask you either or questions, right? Do you identify with your national identity or your ethnic identity? They don't ask you like how much more, how much stronger your affinity is with one versus the other, right? And so I think one direction for all kinds of research on identity, but specifically, as it relates to schooling is, how much can you have these kind of multiple identities? And maybe that's what schooling is doing. It's making us more tolerant, both of others and also of kind of diversity within ourselves in terms of what we feel more or less identification with. Great question. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the offline participants? So we still have 15 minutes. Do you like to wrap up or having a closing statement or just follow my discussions?
Yeah, it's up to you. I mean, I think I would just say like, thanks so much for, for having me. It's great to be back to SMERU and also to hear a lot of, a lot of rich institutional knowledge, which is exactly why I wanted to present this type of work here, because I knew I would hear a lot of details on the current policy context, but also on the history that, I just don't get outside of Indonesia. And so it's really nice to get this feedback. And yeah, please don't be shy about emailing me later and with other ideas and thoughts, and very open to hearing more of what you have to say.
Okay, thank you, Sam. So before we wrap up today's discussions, I would like to invite the participants in the offline to make a round of applause. So the last one. Thank you for Sam for sharing his research with Ben and also Hilmi, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. So I would like to remind you again, don't forget to fill in the attendance forms and give your rate on the participants' satisfaction survey. So for those who are at the SMERU's office, we have a showcase of SMERU's publications in front of this room. And for anyone who wants to take a look at Sam's study, you actually can scan QR code on the screen, I suppose, to download it, right? So, oh, it's on your website. You would like to your website?
Just Google me and you'll see my website.
Okay.
But please, I have lots of work on Indonesia, and I'm always looking for more feedback and ideas for future work. So please don't be shy.
Yeah. So for today's.
Not yet. We're still trying. Yeah.
Okay, hopefully you pass through. And for this afternoon, we have a lot of heavy issues discussed in this today's discussions. So I think we could wrap up, and I will say good afternoon and have a nice weekend. And see you at other SMERU's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we will have we will take a picture